On May 13, 1945, a U.S. Army transport plane carrying 24 soldiers crashed into the side of a mountain in the middle of the most uncharted jungle on Earth. 21 people died instantly, and when the smoke cleared, 3 people were still breathing. What these 3 people would encounter in that forest over the next 47 days is something you would never want to face. But in any case, to understand how 24 people ended up on a sightseeing flight over one of the most isolated places on Earth in the middle of a world war, we need to go back a little. By the spring of 1945, the fighting in the Pacific had been going on for nearly 4 years, and the island of New Guinea had become one of the strangest and most brutal theaters of the entire conflict. If you know anything about New Guinea, you'll understand that even without a war, it is not a place that is easy to be in. The island is the second largest in the world, and much of its interior had never been mapped. The mountains that run through its spine rise to over 15,000 feet, and the jungle that covers everything below them is dense enough that aircraft had been disappearing into it for years without anyone ever finding the wreckage. By 1945, hundreds of Allied planes had gone down over New Guinea. Most were never recovered. The jungle simply swallowed them. The American military base at Hollandia on the northern coast had become a large and relatively comfortable outpost by that point in the war, with thousands of soldiers and support staff living and working there. And as you might imagine, after months of living on a jungle island in the middle of a war, people looked for ways to pass the time. One of those ways was sightseeing flights over a hidden valley that pilots had stumbled across the year before. A place so unexpected and so beautiful that they had nicknamed it Shangri-La. The valley had been discovered almost by accident in May of 1944, when an American reconnaissance pilot drifted off course and found himself flying over an enormous gap in the mountains. What he saw below him stopped him cold. Stretching out for nearly 40 miles in every direction was a wide, flat, green valley, completely surrounded by peaks so tall that there was no visible way in or out from the air. And it was not empty. The valley floor was covered in villages, garden plots, and the kind of organized human settlement that suggested people had been living there for a very long time. Later estimates put the population at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people. These were the Dani, a tribe that had developed entirely in isolation from the outside world. They had never seen a car, a gun, or an airplane. They had no metal tools. Their weapons were spears and stone axes, and their conflicts with neighboring tribes were conducted in the form of ritualized warfare that had been going on for generations. Rumors that spread through the Allied base at Hollandia described them as headhunters and cannibals, and while the truth of those rumors was more complicated than the gossip suggested, the soldiers who arranged sightseeing flights over the valley did so with the understanding that landing inside it was not something anyone wanted to do. The valley was beautiful from the air. It was something else entirely from the ground. And on the afternoon of May 13, 1945, 3 people were about to find that out firsthand. The flight had begun normally enough. The plane, a Douglas C-47 transport nicknamed the Gremlin Special, took off from Hollandia in clear weather on the afternoon of May 13th with 24 people on board, 5 crew members and 19 passengers, including 9 women from the Women's Army Corps. The pilot, Colonel Peter Prosson, flew south toward the mountains and descended toward the valley so the passengers could get a better look at the villages below. That's when the clouds closed in. Unable to determine his exact position in the sudden poor visibility, Prosson continued to descend, hoping to get below the cloud cover and reestablish his bearings. It was a decision that left no margin for error in a valley surrounded on every side by mountains. Within moments of beginning the descent, the Gremlin Special flew directly into the side of a peak overlooking the valley floor. The impact was catastrophic. 19 people died instantly, including Prosson and his co-pilot. 5 passengers survived the initial crash, but 2 of them, both women, died from their injuries within hours. That left 3. Lieutenant John McCollum had survived with only minor cuts and bruises, but his twin brother Robert had been sitting just a few rows away and was killed on impact. Sergeant Kenneth Decker had a broken right arm, a severe head wound, and burns across much of his body. and Corporal Margaret Hastings had burns covering her legs and feet so extensively that she could barely stand. These 3 people, in varying degrees of injury and shock, were now alone in a burning wreck on the side of a mountain in the middle of a valley that the outside world barely knew existed. McCollum took charge almost immediately, and what happened next said a great deal about the kind of person he was. His brother's body was somewhere in the burning wreckage behind him, and he had no time to process that. There were 2 badly injured people depending on him. No radio, no map, no medicine, and no way to know whether anyone at Hollandia even knew where they had gone down. The first priority was to move away from the burning plane and find a clearing where they might be visible from the air. Getting Hastings down the mountain was the most immediate problem. Her burns made walking nearly impossible, and the terrain below them was steep and densely covered in jungle. McCollum and Decker, despite his own broken arm and head wound, helped her down the slope foot by foot over the course of an entire day. The jungle they moved through was unlike anything any of them had experienced. The undergrowth was thick enough that visibility dropped to just a few feet in every direction. The ground was wet and uneven. Insects were constant, and the air at that altitude carried a chill that none of them had expected from a tropical island. When they finally reached a more open area on the valley floor, they took stock of what they had between them. A handful of hard candy salvaged from the wreckage, the clothes on their backs, and almost nothing else. Hastings later wrote in her diary that the candy was the only food they had for the first several days, and that the 3 of them rationed it with the kind of careful precision that people only develop when they genuinely do not know when the next meal is coming. What they did not yet know was that search aircraft had already been dispatched from Hollandia, and on May 17th, 4 days after the crash, a pilot spotted 3 figures lying on the ground in a clearing on the valley floor. They were alive, but the question of how to actually get them out was one that nobody had a good answer to. While the search planes circled overhead and the rescue planners back at Hollandia tried to figure out what to do, the 3 survivors had a more immediate problem on the ground. The Donnie had found them. It's unclear exactly when the first tribespeople appeared at the edge of the clearing, but McCollum's account describes looking up one morning to find a group of men standing at the tree line, watching. They were carrying spears, they wore almost nothing, and they had almost certainly never seen a white person in their lives. McCollum understood immediately that how he responded in the next few minutes could determine whether all 3 of them survived the week. Moving slowly and deliberately, he walked toward the men with his hands open and his weapons, what little he had, left behind. What followed was one of the stranger diplomatic encounters of the Second World War. Through gesture and patience, McCollum gradually established that the survivors meant no harm. The Donnie, for their part, appeared to conclude that the 3 strange, pale figures who had fallen from the sky in a burning machine were likely spirits of some kind, which in the context of their belief system made the visitors worthy of cautious respect rather than immediate hostility. Over the following days, the relationship deepened in ways none of the survivors could have anticipated. The Donnie brought food, sweet potatoes and pork, and sat with the 3 Americans for hours at a time, studying them with open curiosity. For Hastings, whose burns had begun to develop serious infections in the jungle heat without any medical treatment, the arrival of food made a difference that is difficult to overstate. She later said simply that she believed it kept her alive. And as the days passed and the rescue planners back at Hollandia continued to struggle with the problem of how to reach them, the Donnie quietly became the 4th member of the survival effort. Back at Hollandia, the rescue planning had hit a wall that nobody had anticipated. The valley presented a problem that had no obvious solution. The mountains surrounding it on every side rose too steeply and too high for any conventional approach on foot. There were no roads, no rivers that led in from the coast, and no clearing large enough for a conventional aircraft to land. Dropping supplies by air was possible, and they began doing that almost immediately, sending down food, medicine, and basic equipment to the survivors on the valley floor. But getting the people themselves out was another matter entirely. It was eventually decided that a small team of paratroopers would jump into the valley to provide medical care and establish a base, while the larger rescue problem was worked out. The man who volunteered to lead that team was Captain C. Earl Walter Jr., a Filipino-American officer who understood from the beginning what he was agreeing to. Once his team jumped into that valley, there was no way to get back out on foot. The mountains made it impossible. They were committing themselves to whatever solution the planners eventually came up with no guarantee that a solution existed at all. Walter and his men jumped anyway. 2 medics went in first, and the sight of Hastings' infected burns when they reached her told them immediately that the situation on the ground was more serious than the aerial observations had suggested. What followed was nearly 6 weeks of waiting, planning, and attempting to solve one of the most unusual logistical problems anyone in the Pacific Theater had encountered. And the answer that eventually emerged was one that most of the people involved, when they first heard it, assumed was a joke. The plan was to use gliders, specifically a type of engineless aircraft called the Waco CG-4, which was a large wooden and canvas frame designed to be towed behind a powered plane and then released to land on its own. The problem was that the valley had no runway. What it did have was a narrow strip of relatively flat ground near the river that ran through its floor, and the planners decided that a skilled pilot might be able to bring a glider down onto it if the conditions were right. Getting the glider in was only half the problem. Once it landed and loaded the survivors, there was no way for it to take off again under its own power, because it had none. The solution to this was something called a snatch pickup, a technique that had been tested but never used in an operation of this kind. A powered C-47 would fly low over the valley at speed, trailing a long hook. The glider, sitting on the ground with a rope attached to its nose, would be snagged by the hook as the C-47 passed overhead and yanked violently into the air, going from completely stationary to flying in a matter of seconds. On paper, the physics worked. In practice, nobody was entirely certain what would happen to the people inside the glider when it was snatched off the ground at that speed. On June 28, 1945, 47 days after the Gremlin special had gone down, the first glider descended into the valley. It landed on the narrow strip of ground, loaded Margaret Hastings and one of the paratroopers, and waited. The C-47 came in low over the valley, the hook caught the rope, and the glider was pulled into the sky. It worked. 2 more glider operations followed over the next several hours, each one recovering another group from the valley floor. By the end of the day, McCollum, Hastings, Decker, and the paratroopers who had jumped in weeks earlier were all out. The entire operation, from crash to rescue, had taken 47 days, and every single one of the 3 original survivors made it home alive. Margaret Hastings spent months in hospital, recovering from her burns and infections. She returned home to a brief period of media attention. Journalists at the time were particularly fascinated by the story of a young woman who had survived in a jungle valley surrounded by Stone Age tribespeople, and she handled the attention with a quiet dignity that people who met her tended to remember. Kenneth Decker recovered from his wounds and returned to service. John McCollum, who had held the 3 of them together through 47 days in the valley without once appearing to lose his composure, went back to his military career and rarely spoke publicly about what he had been through. The Dani people of the Baliem Valley, whose generosity toward 3 injured strangers had played a quiet but significant role in keeping them alive, continued to live in the valley for decades afterward, as the outside world slowly found its way to them. The valley is accessible today, and has been for many years. The Dani are still there. As for the Gremlin special itself, the wreckage remains on the mountainside where it came down in 1945, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. Nobody has ever attempted to move it. The story of what happened inside Shangri-La was briefly famous in 1945, reported in newspapers and magazines across the United States, before being overtaken by the end of the war and then largely forgotten. It remained that way for decades, until a journalist named Mitchell Zuckoff published a full account of it in 2011. If this story kept you watching, hit the like button and subscribe to The Mystery Loop. Every week, we bring you true survival stories that most people have never heard. We'll see you in the next one.